finally, we had the chance to ride the Amflow. This is the Amflow PL Pro Carbon, isn't it? The 600 watts version. We are probably one of the last media to review this bike, so we tried to avoid reading too many other reviews because we didn't want to be too biased. But it wasn't easy because there were so many reviews of this bike. And why? Why has this Chinese bike made such an impact? It's very sorted. The frame geometry, the frame design, it looks like something that would come from a seasoned bike manufacturer. But it's not the frame that is making the biggest impact. Sure, it's a light bike, weighing in at 20.4 kilos with these pedals. So without the pedals, we should be at perhaps slightly below 20 kilos for this version. That's the lightest one, 9,799 euros. It's, of course, the motor that is making such an impact. There's been some talk about DJI bringing new technology to the industry, but I don't really think so. This bike has got the 600 watt-hours battery. It's probably either the 5.6 or the 5.8 amp-hour cells, which I saw the first time when Schwam released their motor system with a 630 battery. It had the 5.8 amp-hour cells. The motor, though, 105 newton meters, 800 watts. That's quite a bit more than the other manufacturers. But is that because they're not able to create such a powerful motor? Sure, this is 2.5 kilos, so it's among the lighter ones, but it's just 100 grams lighter than the Shimano EP8. So not a huge difference in the size-weight department. How about the power then? Well, I've talked to several e-bike motor manufacturers over the years, and they are sort of hesitant to talk about motor power. My impression is that's down to trail access, the law. They're trying to interpret the law and stay sort of well within the limits, not to risk any trail access. DJI, though, with their Avinox motor, they might not have the same approach, it seems. So they have created a much more powerful motor, and I believe they're forcing the hands of the other manufacturers. They have to act now because this bike, this motor, is making quite an impact in the EMTB scene. And I think they are able to. Anyway, back to the Amflow. As mentioned, this is the Amflow PL Carbon Pro with a 600 watt-hours battery, the lightest one in the lineup. This bike can also be had with an 800 watt-hours battery. You also got the cheaper model, the Amflow Carbon PL, the non-pro version. It's available in the 800 version, as far as I can tell, only. So there are 3 models, but not all 3 models might be available in all markets. Looking at the specs of this bike, the top of the line version, it's nicely stacked. Fox Factory 36 forks, Fox Performance Float, X Factory top, SRAM XO Eagle Access Transmission Wireless 12-speed drivetrain, Magura MT7 brakes, which are nice. How has Amflow managed to create such a lightweight bike, such a lightweight full power bike? There are, of course, other bikes that are equally as light as this one. Those are mid-power or super light EMTBs. The Orbea Rise is one such bike with similar weight. If we look at the Rise LT M10 carbon version with a 630 watt-hours battery, it weighs about the same. It seems it's got a claim weight of about 20 kilos. It's got the Shimano EP8 motor, so it's got a similarly sized motor too. This is the same suspension travel, 160 front, 150 rear. So it actually is a very similar bike, apart from the fact that Orbea decided to detune the motor for some reason. It obviously isn't necessary. This battery similar cells, same battery design, it will power this 800 watts motor. Anyways, it just goes to show that other manufacturers can, in fact, build a bike with similar weight. And it doesn't seem Amflow has made any big sacrifices to achieve this weight on this bike. Sure, you don't get a detachable battery, which saves a bit weight. None of these lightweight bikes basically do. This stem, it's a strange choice. It's a very light stem, I guess. It sure looks that way. But there is very little clamping this stem to the steerer of the fork. So we had to properly tighten it to avoid the stem slipping the steerer. That seems a tad unnecessary. I mean, if the stem was 10-20 grams heavier, this would have been an issue, and it seems already Amflow has addressed this. New bikes coming out appears to have a beefier stem. I briefly mentioned frame geometry. It looks very sorted, and that's a bit surprising from a newcomer to the industry. But it does, of course, depend on what you're expecting from this bike. 445mm chainstays, that's sort of on the short side these days, but I very much like it. 64.5 degrees, it seems almost the industry standard for a bike with this amount of travel, and I think that's a fine figure because it allows the manufacturers to build a bike with a reasonably quick handling, reasonably quick steering that is also slack enough to do a bit of proper descending. The 475mm reach on this size large bike might look long, but the stack height of this bike, it's 628mm, and that's not a whole lot anymore. And having this lower stack means the effective reach of the bike, the actual reach, is shorter than the reach figure might lead you to believe. So it's not a big bike for a size large, but for this package with a relatively short wheelbase of 1255mm, I think it's spot on. But this bike doesn't come across as a full-out descending enduro bike. So climbing on the Amflow PL Pro Carbon. The motor, of course, allows you to climb very fast. We can go up quite steep climbs at way above 20 kilometers per hour. The seat angle at 77 degrees, that's nice and steep, but that's the effective seat tube angle. The actual seat tube angle after this kink means if you extend the seat post, you will be positioned further backwards on the bike. Combined with the relatively short chainstays, it means you will be the rider center of gravity will be positioned pretty far backwards. That in turn means if you climb very steep stuff, you need to lean forwards. It's difficult just sitting planted on the seat, climbing calmly. If you want to do that, at least you should consider moving the saddle forwards on the rails and perhaps not extend the seat too far, too high. So when going uphill with a slightly rearward shifted center of gravity and a motor that is quite powerful, I mean, if you suddenly decide to stab the pedals to increase the pace, chances are the front end will lift in the climbs. So climbing properly steep stuff in maximum assistance, you have to focus a bit, move forwards on the saddle. But if you drop the motor power to like the 600 watts found on much of the competition, the bike will be less eager to lift the front wheel in the steep ups. The motor behavior too affects the climbing abilities of this bike. When riding steep technical stuff, you come into a section, perhaps you have to stop pedaling ever so slightly, shift your balance and then start pedaling again, or just to roll an obstacle. The motor will disengage and it can take a slight amount of time before it activates again. Not a whole lot, but just slightly more than what we are used to from the competition, which might be enough for you to struggle and come to a stop. Also, there is a motor overrun function. In the default setting, which is low, it felt perfectly fine. I mean, there was little motor overrun and no misbehavior from the motor. But when we increased the motor overrun, we got on the bike in a climb, stabbed the pedals for less than half a rotation to get a bit of a shove, but there was nothing, so we leaned back from the attack position, and as we did, the motor engaged. So we were in a less than ideal position on the bike, front end very light. That's of course something we were able to adjust to. It was just a bit surprising the first time that there was such a delay from hitting the pedals to having the motor over and activating. But it made for some very interesting maneuvers on the trails. I mean, we tried using it to our advantage and it could be quite fun. On this light bike, we found we could sort of hop a bit in the technical sections, use the motor overrun to kick us forwards after we have come to terms with how much time it took for it to activate. And it's not a whole lot, it's just marginally different to what we're used to. And I think both of these things can be addressed through a software update. And I've got no issues with that. That's quite common for motor manufacturers to tweak the motor with future software updates. We had a lot of fun riding this bike and this motor on the climbs, but in some instances we were a bit worried because it's a powerful motor, and if we misjudge or make an error, this bike could properly send us into trouble. So stepping down to trail mode, perhaps even the auto mode, it improves the handling of the motor slightly, and that could be a good thing in some situations. We decided to mount power pedals on this bike, and we compared it to the Shimano EP801 and the Bosch Performance CX5 Gen 5, the new one. Problem was the gear ratios were different between the bikes, so it's difficult to do a precise direct comparison, but the results were interesting still. First, we went up this climb at 65 cadence in a comparable gear ratio. So the idea is you go up the same hill in the same amount of time and you see how hard have you been pedaling. The Shimano EP801 and the Avinox motor, we got up pedaling very lightly, 60 something watts. While the Bosch Performance CX motor, we were pedaling a little under 100 watts. So a noticeable difference, but not a big deal. Then we increased the cadence to 80, went a bit faster, and we had to pedal just over 100 watts on the Bosch motor. The Shimano and this Avinox motor, they required 80 something. So they were sort of still quite similar. But that changed for the 100 cadence test. We went above 150 watts of rider input on both the Shimano and the Bosch motor. And this bike, it remained at 80 something watts. So we were going much faster uphill, and all we had to do was basically increase the cadence. We didn't have to put in any more power. And that's a result of this being an 800 watts motor. And when we tried riding the hill as fast as we could, the other bikes had no chance keeping up. All of the testing was done in the sort of 105 Newton meters mode, the turbo mode on this bike. But there is also a boost mode. And when activating the boost, it's a proper shuttle mode. We can go up close to motor cutoff speed in steep climbs and arrive well rested, having spent very little of our energy. But of course, we are draining the battery on this bike. Earlier during the winter, We were riding in temperatures at around 0 degrees, and we were able to drain the 600 watt-hours battery in less than 25 kilometers. But we also were able to ride close to 40, so it depends on how much power you access. And if you always want to access as much power as possible, yeah, the 800 watt-hours battery, it makes sense. When riding flatter trails, the motor makes less of an impact on the riding experience. And now it's time for the frame to shine, because as I mentioned, it's a slightly compact frame and it's a light bike. So we had a lot of fun riding the flatter trails. We were sort of using more of the trail, going from side to side, searching for new lines, obstacles to ride creatively. And it's a lot of fun, but going into corners, braking, accelerating out of them, it's of course a completely different story on this bike compared to especially the SL bikes. We were riding trail mode quite a bit, and we didn't really notice much of a difference compared to the turbo mode, maximum assistance. There is supposed to be a slight difference, even though both top out at 105 Newton meters. Depending on how you ride, this motor in trail mode might ramp up a bit slower. But yeah, not much of a difference. And perhaps we want a mode that ramps up even slower than the trail mode. I guess you could reduce the power a bit, but you got the auto mode. I'm not really sure why they decided to name it auto mode, because it seems to behave the same way trail mode does. It just ramps up a tad slower. So on these flatter trails, I quite enjoyed the auto mode. And then there's the descents. I spent quite some time fiddling with the suspension on this bike. But yeah, there are limits to how stable a bike with a relatively short wheelbase, not too heavy of a bike, there are limits to how stable and composed it can be on the descents. The rear wheel dissector is quite light, but still the rear suspension was functioning quite nicely on the descents. If we want a more stable bike, burlier tires is a good idea, and perhaps the 800 watt-hours battery will aid the stability and sort of make the bike calmer on the trails. But this wasn't supposed to be an enduro bike. It's a perfectly fine design choice. And the motor was quite silent. It seems perhaps a tad more silent than the Bosch and the Shimano motors, at least when pedaling with the same amount of power output. Descending, coasting seemed fine, but there were a few occasions where I could hear some motor rattle, and I think that happened in the smaller gears. So some amount of motor rattle, but not anything like what we're used to from the previous Shimano and Bosch motors. Not a concern to me. So the Amflow PL Carbon, it rides like an SL bike. It's got the frame geometry and ride characteristics of a lighter trail bike. It's a fun and inspiring ride on less aggressive trails. That means the frame isn't designed for the steepest inclines. The motor very much can handle the steep inclines, and it would be fun riding it in a bike designed for climbs. But the motor, of course, is heaps of fun on this bike too. It can be a tad slow to activate, and the overrun function can be a tad slow. But yeah, I assume DJI will address it. But making the motor activate quicker might also make it more of a handful in the technical climbs. Still, I think there is room for some optimization. DJI definitely is pushing the industry, forcing the hands of the other e-bike motor manufacturers. The world of EMTBs is now moving at an even faster pace. Cool. That's it. Appreciate any likes and subscribes. Thanks for watching.